Hello and well met. This is Founder Layron with Fantasy Grounds Academy. Today we are going to tackle a topic that most people don't want to cover or maybe not even want to hear about, depending on what the issues that you might be having with Fantasy Grounds. This is going to talk about your digital hygiene and how you use Fantasy Grounds in general, and also some things outside of Fantasy Grounds that may help with performance, lag, or any other issues. So I have a list here of things that I see daily or weekly in the forums, in our Discord community, and also hearing this from other players and people's Fantasy Grounds. So I'm going to pull up this image, and we're going to talk about things that can lower your performance while using Fantasy Grounds Unity. Quite often I get people that ask questions about performance issues, or they'll post messages on the forums, and that's a good place to share your problems and such. So if you have those issues, make sure that you forward your log and your campaign so that the customer service at SmiteWorks can take care of those issues. There are some things you should probably know, or maybe you already know, but I'm going to go over these. And there's 4 main things that I've noticed that cause issues. So let's start with excessive content. And this is something that I'm guilty of. I'm not perfect. I've basically come across all these issues. So excessive content means just bringing in too much crap. So too many tokens. So what that means is if you have a bunch of custom tokens and you're trying to use them in your campaign, there is such a thing as too many. Now, that exact number depends on your system, but after a while, as you bring in content, especially third-party content, it's going to create overhead and a lot of lag on Fantasy Grounds. So if every one of these NPCs and characters has custom tokens, and they're all pretty good size and quality and such, and dimensions, that can really slow things down. And even if you're not using the tokens and you have them loaded in your campaign, it still causes some memory requirements. So that's something you may want to think about. Also, having large maps. So large third-party maps that are like PNG files or that are greater than a couple megabytes in size are generally not necessary. A lot of people do this. They'll find a map online or they'll make their own map, and they're just huge. I mean, they're large dimensionally and they're large file size wise. So you want to try to optimize maps as best you can. There is a best practice. Generally, you want to keep that file size to 2 to 5 megabytes at the most. Start getting beyond that, it's unnecessary. The other thing is the dimensions. So 2000 by 2000 roughly is the maximum. If you're any larger than that, you're going to start running into performance issues, especially when you go to share those images with your players if you're playing online. So the key is to try to learn to use some of the assets that are in Fantasy Grounds already. That way it's not causing a memory issue. Because if you use and build your maps in Fantasy Grounds, it cuts down the amount of memory required. Basically, you're only sending the coordinates, the data, the file names, that sort of thing across your network, and not these large whopping images. So that's something that you'll have to learn and understand over time. So it's no problem bringing in your own content. It's just that if you have more than a couple items and you're sharing those, it starts to tax the overall bandwidth that you have available across your internet to share with your players. So generally when you're by yourself, when you're working on your content or you are setting up for your campaign, it's not an issue. It's local. You're not sharing anything. You're just working with your own computer. The minute you have people connect to your table and you start sharing these assets with them, that's when things start to slow down. The next thing is too many modules loaded. So I'm guilty of this too. In my library, this is probably about the most you need to have open at any given time. And it depends on your rule set and which what you're doing and that sort of thing. But if you've already got all your characters built and you're ready to play, like in this case, I have Lost Mine and Fend loaded. I have the module, I have the 3 core books, and then I have 1 third-party object that I got from the DM's Guild loaded. Now, if you have more than this, it's probably a little excessive. The only exception to that is when you're leveling up or when you need to build characters. Other than that, there's no reason to have 20 books open. If you're running off the seat of your pants, you can actually load content ahead of time, drag and drop the links that you need, or make copies of it, and you can run like that without having to have 20,000 different books open. That's generally something that taxes your performance as well. So the only time you really need to share content, all the different books, is when you're building characters and such. But when you're actually running the game, to be honest, I don't even need all this. So if I go to my modules group here, and I can click on a filter that only shows what I have loaded. So technically, to run this game, I don't even need the Dungeon Master's Guide. That's just a nice little bonus over the top. And Lost Mine of Phandelver is self-contained, so you don't need a lot of content for that. I don't need the monster manual unless I'm going to add my own custom creatures, and even then I do that ahead of time so I don't have to keep it open the whole time. So I just unload that. And then when it comes to this monster loot, this is a convenience thing. This isn't really something I have to have loaded, but I'll leave it loaded because what that does is it gives me access to all the potential loot that the monsters might have in a given session. So that's why I had that loaded. But to be honest, that's just another thing that I don't actually need to run the game, and turn that on or off as needed. So those are the only two books I really would have, is the Player's Handbook and the Lost Mine of Phandelver. Occasionally you'll have to load another one when you're looking something up, but not very often. So try to keep your module load down, especially when you're in the middle of a game. During character creation, unfortunately, you're going to have a lot more books open. And when that happens, you only have one or two players connected at a time building characters at your table. And that usually cuts down the lag and the amount of data that's shared. Because everything that's shared is being updated in real time. It's being shared back and forth between you and your players. Multiply that by 4 to 6 people, and now that even expands it even more. So your bandwidth goes away as you share more and more data and as your campaign grows. So try to keep that down to a minimum. You can turn books back on or off as needed. So you don't have to have 20,000 books open. Just one for reference for looking up rules, and then the module. You don't maybe one other book. You don't need 20 books or whatever. Only during character creation or leveling up, or if you're doing some research and you're building your own stuff. That's an exception. But other than that, when you have people connected to your table, try not to have too much content shared. So that's the wisdom there. Too many images shared overall. So what this means is as your campaign grows, you're going to be sharing images. It could be background pictures. It could be, diagrams. It could be the maps themselves, the player maps. So I'm going to open up the images area. This is the campaign folder for Lost Mine of Phandelver as far as the images go. And if you look on the right-hand side, you have this little letter P. Well, that's indicative of anything that I have shared with the table. We might be in the middle of the module, and we've already done the Cragmaw hideout. So if that's the case, you don't need to share that anymore if you don't intend to go back there. So as the game master, I can unshare it by clicking on that letter P, or you can go to the image itself, right-click on it, go to sharing, and click Stop Sharing Record. And that will start to cut down a little bit of your lag too. So as your campaign grows, you're not constantly having more and more images that are going to impact your session. So that's something you should do as you go. It's a hygiene thing, so you kind of clean up after yourself as you do your sessions. That makes things a lot smoother. So just as a reminder, just go into your images folder, find out which images are loaded and if you need to keep them. Like I have a Sword Coast Players map that I'll leave that one because we'll refer to that quite a bit. We're in the Red Brand hideout, so we'll leave that. The map of Phandalin, probably leave that one. But we're no longer at the Cragmaw hideout, so I'm going to right-click on it and stop sharing record. Or you can just click on the little letter P and it will make it go away. So that's something you should do as you go along. And these are just covering maps. You could have all kinds of different things shared with your players, but turn the ones off that you don't need. That'll help a little bit with your lag and your performance issues. Okay, so extreme or unnecessary processes. This is stuff more internal to Fantasy Grounds. So one thing unfortunately you have to mention is third-party extensions. When you're having issues and you report that, that's one of the first things that customer service is going to ask you. They're going to ask you, do you have any extensions loaded? That's the first place you want to look if you're having any issues, especially if you were playing fine and then all of a sudden nothing works. It could potentially be that Fantasy Grounds is updated and the developer of that extension has not had time to make changes or update it as well. So if that's the case, do a process of elimination, turn them on and off, load the campaign, see if you get different results. You can't do that in the middle of a game, unfortunately, but when you're not playing in a game and you're noticing issues, load up those extensions, turn them on and off, and find out which ones are giving you problems. That's the only way you're going to know. Using too many of them, like 5 different ones at a time, that could be problematic for lag, depending on what it does and how it interfaces with the rule set. But quite often it forces Fantasy Grounds to update and to look up stuff. So if that's the case, and you have 3 or 4 of those processes available and going, it makes things a little slower for Fantasy Grounds. Depends on what it does. Usually cosmetic extensions don't cause a lot of overhead unless there's a lot of graphics involved. But the ones that change the way Fantasy Grounds works, those ones tend to break more often. So you got to be careful with those. Too many occluder data points. So what that means is if you go into a given map, whether you put the occluder points or not, you will notice that there's all these little dots. So if you go into, let's say this is the Kragma hideout, if you are the game master, you can unlock this, go to the line of sight mode, and as you can see, there's quite a bit of occluders in this, and that's these little dots. So all these little data points, Fantasy Grounds has to go in and recalculate those every second. So it's not a static thing. So when you have all these occluders on here, that's going to potentially cause more lag and performance issues, and they've actually made a tool to help battle this. So here's some terrain. Maybe I can get away with taking some of these occluders out. So if I go to the line of sight tool, and if I click on one of these links, on the bottom says simplify selected occluder. So this is a fairly simple but easy, effective method to remove some of the excess amounts of these occluders. So if you click on this down arrow, it will remove some of those that are unnecessary. Same thing with here. Maybe you got too many in this section down here, so you just click on one of the dots, click the down arrow, and it will remove quite a few of those. And there's more over here, so I just kind of look at something that has a whole bunch of occluders in it. And if you reduce the amount of occluders on your maps, or if you know that ahead of time, you can go in and change those and get rid of some of your performance issues. So that is something that has been learned over time as the product is developing and changing. Smiteworks and other, the users and developers realize that these occluders can cause a lot of problems. So you want to make sure that you're, that you're going to not create too many more issues for yourself. So you may want to just occlude some of the occluders. So you click on one of these points and you simplify it, and it gets rid of a ton of excess points that you probably don't need. Now, don't overdo it. You just do it once or twice. If you do it more than that, then it starts taking away the actual form that you're looking at. So you just maybe once will do it, and that'll clean it up, and it will get rid of some of the things that you really don't need. So that's kind of a 50-50 on that, depending on what kind of map you're using and who put it together. Smiteworks has been a lot more clever lately about how many they include now in their maps. They realize that there's a performance drop when Fantasy Grounds has to recalculate all this. So that's something that might happen to you if you're building your own maps. You might have way too many little pieces of detail there. So get rid of a few of those, and it should help your performance. So that's something that you're just going to learn over time. I'm not expecting anyone to remember that, but that is a factor. Large background decals. So I have one right now, which is this Fantasy Grounds logo here, Fantasy Grounds Academy logo. So what that does is it adds more overhead to the overall need to run this campaign. So technically, I don't even need this loaded or active. If you're going to do one like this, make it a PNG file and make it smaller so it doesn't take so much memory. This one I have now is a high quality PNG file, and it can cause lag because it's just a huge file. It doesn't need to be that big. I can convert it to a JPEG and get similar results, and it's not going to lose that much quality. So that the background images can sometimes cause that issue, especially the older ones, the decals. Those are raw data that weren't included in the campaign. So if you have any of those loaded, that can also cause more issues. So the other thing is large amounts of NPCs loaded in the combat tracker. So right now in the combat tracker, I have a bunch of goblins and I have some players. When you start having to scroll up and down on this combat tracker, and I have it stretched out quite a ways, that's getting to be a little bit excessive. So try to keep your encounters smaller, and if they're not, you can learn how to break them up in Fantasy Grounds. So I have an example that I could bring up potentially. So here's an example of an encounter that's in the Lost Mine of Fendelver in the caverns. So quite often what you'll see is this one ain't bad. There's a fire pit, there's a couple goblins, Clarg, and his dog. Well, if you have 12 goblins in here and you have all these other NPCs, it's going to start getting to be a little excessive in the combat tracker. Combat tracker isn't designed for mass combat. I mean, it'll do its best to keep track of everything. But what happens is with all these tokens loaded and connected to a map, it creates a big performance hit on Fantasy Grounds because you got way too many things being represented in the combat tracker and on the map. So try to break these up. So what I would do with this is the fire pit. Honestly, I would make that a whole separate encounter, and I would just put it as an NPC, and I wouldn't even load it on the combat tracker unless I needed to. There's an attack roll associated with it. If you fall or get pushed into the fire, you can just drag that onto the bad guys without having to even have this loaded. The 12 goblins, I might split that up into half. So maybe I'll go with 4 goblins and Clarg, and then the other 8 goblins would be on another encounter. And you can kind of bring them in waves so that it's not excessive. You don't want 20,000 combat entries because that really slows things down. And I know if people have done it. I've experienced it a little bit. Kind of knew better just from my own experience that I don't like huge encounters or mass combat. If you need to do a mob, you can make an NPC that would represent, let's say, 10 goblins, and that would help. Rule sets like Savage Worlds, they actually accommodate for that. D&D does not. So if you play some of the other rule sets, they have more accommodations for larger groups of combatants. So that's just something to keep in mind and something you want to put into practice if possible. You'll have to know how to reconstruct an encounter, but once you understand that process, it's not that bad. Let's see. So, yes, so more than 6 players at a time. Now, I'm not saying don't have more than 6 players. I'm only suggesting it. Between 3 and 5 is the sweet number. Get more than 6, then you start creating lag because you have too much information being passed back and forth, and it's taxing your bandwidth. And the other thing is managing your turns. It takes too long to have someone get a turn. So if you have more than 6 players, it's not ideal for Fantasy Grounds or for play style. It would really aggravate people. Maybe in a one shot you can get away with that, but if you're running a campaign like that and you got more than 6 players, I feel sorry for them. So try to keep that to as less as possible. It's fine to have a full party, but once you have more than 6 or so on there, it really starts to bog things down. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so those are internal things that you can do to keep lag and performance issues down. Now, there's some things outside of Fantasy Grounds, and these are just suggestions. This doesn't fit everyone's situation. So I want to make that clear. So these are just suggestions based off of what I've seen in customer service, in our community Discord, and on the forums. So one thing you want to remember is that you may not have enough available upload speed for bandwidth. So if you don't have at least 10 up, that means upload, not the download speed. You could have issues when people connect to you that you don't have enough throughput to send the data out to the players. That's a common issue, and that's caused by a lot of these other issues. So if you're experiencing that and you're having problems with lag, that is crazy, and that's something you want to avoid. Yeah, I have that same problem, Banks. I have way too many. I got a couple gigs worth. That's like 4 years worth of collecting and tokens. So that is a problem, and it increases your load time. So when you're loading Fantasy Grounds and you got all that content, it really takes a long time. So I have a ton of things from the DMs Guild. I actually need to go through that and clean all that up. And I have extra campaign folders that have images in them that I don't need, and all kinds of stuff. So we're talking about digital hygiene in that case. So you may not have enough available upload speed. Antivirus and firewall settings, those can get in the way of things. So if you have an antivirus working in the background, and as you're downloading these cached images, the antivirus program might be scanning it as it comes in, and that could slow down the performance on your computer or on your player side, depending on who has the software. So that's something that can happen. Video card drivers. So recently I've seen where they've made a thing on the Atlassian where you want to reset your video card settings or create them to accommodate for Fantasy Grounds. I don't think it likes a lot of fancy 3D performance enhancements. I think a lot of it boils down to just having a solid video card drivers and having the settings so that you're not using all these special graphics things for Fantasy Grounds. This doesn't really need it. So your video card settings and the drivers might make a difference in performance. Another thing is background tasks and other processes. So if you are downloading stuff and watching videos and doing all kinds of other stuff, or you got people in your family using your Wi-Fi pretty heavily or your internet, it's going to cause network issues, and that's going to affect your game. So if my wife is on her phone and my kids are playing with their Xbox, and then they're doing homework on their computers, and then I have something going on out here like a session, or I got some stuff I'm working on for social network or social media, that all that stuff adds up. So when you're using your computer, try not to have 50,000 things in the background. Even though you have the best computer and it's brand new, it does not fix the available bandwidth issue. I don't know how many times someone says, I got a brand new computer and it's top of the line and I have all this hardware. That does not matter. What matters is the network. If you don't have the upload speed, or you have too many things going on through your network, it's not going to matter how fast your computer is. It does not do much at all. Fantasy Grounds will take advantage of a faster computer a little bit. It does help a little, but it doesn't help with the lag and performance issues too much. And you'll notice that as you learn to use the platform and you learn about your computer and software you're using and such, is that a lot of these issues can be avoided just with some simple digital hygiene. So some other factors. Fantasy Grounds Unity updates. Are all of your players and yourself on the same revision level? I don't know how many times I've seen people say, yeah, well, no one could connect. Well, yeah, half your players didn't update. Or maybe you didn't update and everyone did. So you need to be on the same page with your players and make sure that you communicate about who's been updating and whatnot. Also, make sure you're not on the live test beta and then everyone else isn't. So if you're testing stuff in Fantasy Grounds, you need to go back to the original version and do that, because they can't connect to you, and also there's so many changes and differences that it's not going to be healthy. Old or unsupported hardware. I don't know how many times I've looked at this, but what I've seen is that a lot of people were using Fantasy Grounds Classic, or they have older machines, or they're using their wife's old computer, whatever it may be. It may be time to update your system if you're going to run Unity. I'm not saying go out and buy a new computer, but you might have to get a new video card, you might have to get a new hard drive, or you might have to get a whole new computer. There's people running, Windows 7 or just stuff like that. Or you got someone trying to use their tablet trying to connect to Fantasy Grounds. Or you got a guy that's out on his deck on a wireless connection, with barely any bandwidth, and he's tethered to a cell phone. I mean, this is the type of thing that kind of makes the experience not so great. So if you're using Fantasy Grounds, it's better to have a little bit more up-to-date hardware, have an understanding of your network capabilities. So it's better to plug in than be on a wireless, because slow or wireless internet definitely brings the whole table down. You kind of come to a crawl if you got one or two players that can't stay connected, or whenever they're doing stuff, it's unresponsive. So that a lot of that is just common sense, or at least digital hygiene. So that's something that most of these problems will go away. Not all of them. There's some performance issues with Fantasy Grounds itself, but a lot of these can be avoided. I would say 2/3 of the issues that I've seen are probably from these very reasons. And just the basic lack of understanding of your computer and the hygiene within. So, do you have a fragmented hard drive? Are you running out of hard drive space? Are you running some old crap from like 2000 or something? So, all these things factor in to making the experience better. And especially if you're the host, if you're not doing these things, you can really make things problematic for your table, for yourself. You're going to get frustrated. You might even stop using it just because it's not working. Technically, it's not Fantasy Grounds, it's the users. And I hate to say that because I'm probably one of the worst ones out there. Is I've had issues, and you know what? Every time I've looked into it, just about 90% of the time, it's been my own fault. Because I'm using an extension that's broken, or I've got 20,000 modules, or whatever. So keep that in mind when you're using Fantasy Grounds before you start saying that Fantasy Grounds sucks, or you're going to go to Foundry now because Fantasy Grounds doesn't do what it says it's going to do. All that is just ignorance and not understanding the program itself, or how it works, or even your own computers. And one thing I wanted to mention that most people don't think about is we use Discord a lot for communication when we're playing games. Sometimes Discord can be an issue. They have optimized it, and it's a lot better than it used to be, but it really sucks a lot of resources. Something you want to watch out for when you're in a Discord channel is that the kilobytes per second for the audio quality is not too high. You set that up higher than the default, and you have players connected, that's going to also take bandwidth. That takes your voice bandwidth and expands it by quite a bit if you raise the quality. So be careful with Discord, because that is a resource hog. And if you're messing around with the settings in the channel to get better audio, chances are you're affecting your overall experience with Fantasy Grounds, because you're using up bandwidth for other things. So keep that in mind when you're running Fantasy Grounds. Just don't have too much content. Don't load or use unnecessary things if not needed. Understand your networking and your limitations and the things you have on your computer that might be preventing your session from going well. And then, of course, there's just some basic stuff like common sense and computer hygiene and understanding how your computer works. So and understanding that other programs will affect other processes. So these are the tips that I gathered over the last few years of using Fantasy Grounds. And these are generally things that troubleshooting or customer service will ask you to check for. So just be careful, and just remember that a lot of this stuff is not just Fantasy Grounds. It's the users, the host, and your internet access. It could be that you're having a bad day. Bad problems where everybody in my neighborhood must be online, and it's taking up the node for the data. So our internet goes to a crawl when we're trying to use it. And I have really good, decent, bandwidth. Got over 30 kilobytes per second or whatever up, so it's plenty for broadcast. But I'm probably not actually getting that because of the network congestion. So even if you have a good upload speed, that doesn't mean you're getting that. That is the advertised speed. The average is probably a lot less. So if I'm advertised at 30 or 40 up, I'm probably only getting about half of that because of the other users in my neighborhood or in the region. So there's other factors too to consider. You have line conditions and weather and expanding and contracting, and you get noise in your internet lines that cause performance issues. So not everything is a fantasy grounds issue. Just remember that. And I'm not defending it. I just know that a ton of times it's been the users or a misunderstanding of how things work. So I think that's all I got. I think I've yammered enough. So we talked about digital hygiene, talked about having excessive data points on your maps. We talked about having too large of encounters. And we also talked about just using third-party extensions that are conflicting or that are not up to date. So those are things that you're going to have to get used to and work around. And regardless of what platform you go to, you're going to have similar issues. So I've seen people knock. They say, oh well, Fantasy Grounds is this or this platform does that, but really they all have strengths and weaknesses. But it really comes down to the users and their understanding and their digital hygiene. That bottom line, that's the biggest thing. So hopefully that helps some of you. If it upsets any of you, I'm sorry, I apologize, but it's the truth, and it's something that I've learned over the months and years that I've been using Fantasy Grounds. And to be honest, these problems were still the same thing in Classic. Most of these issues are no different than what's going on now. So if you use Classic, you understand what I'm saying. A lot of this stuff, it comes down to digital hygiene. So anyways, take care, everybody. You have a good week. Friday's coming up, and hopefully you get some game in it. So take care, everybody.